For 50 years, the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry has hosted the nation's premier exhibition of Black art. The Black Creativity Juried Art Exhibition features over 100 works from professional and emerging Black artists from across the country, highlighting Black achievement in art, science, and technology. Now open through April 27th. For more details, visit msichicago.org. Today on CityCast Chicago, somehow we've managed to go about a month without doing a full episode on the Chicago School Board, which honestly might be a new record for us. But since they're having a full meeting this week, we thought it'd be a good time to check in on how it's going for the city's first ever partly elected school board. It's Monday, February 24th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. I am here with Chalkbeat Chicago Bureau Chief Becky Vevea. Becky, welcome back to CityCast Chicago.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to get into some of the dynamics at play on this board and the big issues they're facing. But Becky, we got some long-awaited news last week as Mayor Brandon Johnson finally appointed the final member of the school board. Who is Cindy Wallace of the 8th District?
Yeah, so Sydney Wallace, we know from Chicago Board of Elections records that she tried to run for Police District Council on the Southwest Side in Police District 8, which is also the school board district she'll represent, but didn't have enough signatures. She is an activist. She's Jewish. She sits on the board of the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, and she is a resident of the Chicago Law neighborhood, a mother of 4, I think all of whom have gone to CPS. Her oldest just graduated from CPS. Mm-hmm. The elected member there is Angel Gutierrez.
He's an elected school board member in that district from Garfield Ridge.
Correct.
I mean, he has a ton of different viewpoints. You'd probably say he's more of a pro-charter school candidate. He talks a lot about the fiscal health of Chicago public schools. How does Sydney Wallace compare or differ from him?
Well, she was born and raised on the South Side. She went to an HBCU, Spelman College in Atlanta. My sense is that she leans more in kind of ideologically in Mayor Johnson's direction. Mm-hmm. But, we'll see where she lands when it comes to school policies and things like school choice and balancing budgets once she gets sworn in on Thursday, the 27th.
You've really been helping us navigate this entire process. Do you have a sense of why it took so long?
I think the mayor's office attempted to address this head on because people were like, why haven't you made this appointment? And really, I think they boiled it down to these are unpaid and often thankless jobs. We know they are unpaid. They do require a significant amount of a person's time. And so I think they probably were just trying to find somebody who was up for the job and willing to do it for free.
Am I wrong in saying that some of the Acero schools fall in District 8?
You're not wrong in thinking that. No, it's a heavily, pretty majority Latino district, and Acero serves a large population of Latino students. And some of the schools that the Acero board was planning to close, that the school board, the CPS school board, is now saying that they will keep open, do fall into that district.
Got it. When we talked about these school board elections, we talked a lot about what kind of voting lines we might see, which candidates were, let's say, funded by pro-charter school groups, people funded by teachers union, maybe more independent candidates, and also how they interact with the mayor's appointees. Because again, this is a hybrid board. 11 members ultimately selected by the mayor, 10 voted on by the rest of us. Do we have any indication if these alliances are shaking out as expected thus far? I know we just at the start of this thing.
Yes, we are just at the start of this thing. We do see, yes, some of these alliances starting to take shape. There's one, I would say, kind of notable person who was endorsed by the CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, who I think has become a more independent member of the Board of Education since being elected. That's Jennifer Custer. She represents District 1, far northwest side of the city. And I do think you see folks who kind of are falling into this independent kind of challenge the mayor or question the mayor kind of camp. And then you have folks who are obviously his appointees carrying out some of what he has advocated for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, challenging the mayor seems like something that's not just happening in this board right now, in this situation.
Right.
How could a person like me start to see these alliances take shape? Is it happening just in meetings? Are we seeing people meeting outside of the board meetings?
No, yeah, I would say mostly in meetings. There was this, in this first meeting that they had to select themselves a vice president. And there was a group of the independents, about 7 or 8 of them, who nominated a woman in District 6 named Jessica Biggs to be the vice president. They did not ultimately win that vote because the mayor's appointees selected someone else, Olga Bautista, to serve as the vice president. So that was an interesting dynamic. You also did see when they were kind of forming committees and getting appointments to boards that are not the Chicago Public Schools Board. So the Board of Education has kind of seats on other boards like the Public Building Commission, which is this commission that decides various public building projects. They vote on them. And usually, historically, some representative from the Board of Ed, typically the board president, has taken those seats. The pension board is another example. And again, these were sort of like, there was like a formal vote to appoint someone to be in those seats. And you saw this faction of independents say, well, wait a minute, why is it a foregone conclusion that it's going to be Sean Hardin? Maybe how can we volunteer? How can any member of this 20-member board throw their hat in the ring to sit on these outside boards? So right now you're seeing a lot of it kind of play out in this, minutia of governance.
These attempts at power play. We're electing a vice president who's going to represent our voice and agenda on outside boards. I'm not gonna lie. As you were saying that, I was sitting over like, oh, okay. So the voting blocks have emerged. And yet when we're talking about the vote for Olga Bautista, for example, were the only people who voted for her members of that sort of 10-pack of mayor appointees, or did some of those, I guess it would have been 3 remaining members, not in the independent block as well.
Right. So it was the mayor's appointees, the 10 appointees, and then there were 3 elected members, all of whom had the backing of the Chicago Teachers Union in their bids to win election and to win those seats. So the mayor kind of vis-a-vis his appointees, as well as the allies at the CTU putting aligned folks into these seats, he has about a 14-member majority on this 21-member school board. So through a combination of winning elected seats and his appointments, he holds a decent majority. Now, the question will be, so coming up, one thing we've been watching, or, everyone probably has been watching a little bit, is the negotiations with the Chicago Teachers Union and kind of getting an agreement done between the union and the district. Once that agreement happens, assuming we get one, that will have to be voted on by the board. And then importantly, the board will have to approve an amendment to the budget. Now, budget amendments require, I believe it's 2/3 vote of the board. So in order to pass a budget amendment, they'll need more than a simple majority. So again, that 15-member roughly majority that the mayor holds presumably would, I'm trying to do my math here, I think would still give him the votes. But for any vote where there's, like I said, more of a threshold that needs to be met, budget amendments, that kind of thing, you might see this independent, I don't want to call it a caucus, but this independent alliance is a block. Yes, exactly. Block is the right word. You might see them
I like
be
alliance
able to.
though. I was like, that felt a lot more shady. Alliance was nice. That felt like Survivor, where it's like, we got an alliance for now.
Yeah, I know. It's like feels a little Game of Thronesy, which houses are aligned with which houses.
And even though the mayor's influence is playing out in his favor, it doesn't mean that we're not having more debates or more conversation about protocol about how historically things have been rubber stamped, or like you said, just assumed that the president would take on positions. Even if those things ultimately happen, it isn't as cut and dry.
Exactly. It's not this foregone conclusion that there's a rubber stamp, approving whatever the mayor wants. You have dissension and tension just by virtue of having more diverse viewpoints on the board and elected from different places in the city and with the backing of, different ideologies.
Back for a second year due to popular demand, Black Creativity Night Out returns to the Museum of Science and Industry on Friday, March 21st from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. This over 21 event is part gallery walk, part function. It's going to be a great time, y'all. Get an exclusive look at the Black Creativity Juried Art exhibition, plus many of the museum's most popular exhibits without all of those crowds. Celebrate Black creativity in all its forms with featured artists from the Juried Art exhibition, amazing performances, and a lively dance floor. The evening will highlight Black creatives from the Chicagoland area and beyond. You don't want to miss this unforgettable night of culture and enjoyment. For tickets and more information, visit msichicago.org. I've got some great Chicago theater you don't want to miss. Steppenwolf Theater revives Fool for Love by Sam Shepard. Perhaps the sexiest, most haunting play of the 20th century, Fool for Love is a twisted tequila soaked love letter from one of the greatest American playwrights, indulging the need to get inside someone just to tear them apart. The Sun-Times and Daily Herald gave it 4 stars, and the Reader calls it an exhilarating acting showcase. The show is peak Steppenwolf with searing performances and masterful direction, and a revival of this eerie, ominous, and beautiful masterpiece. Fool for Love is on stage now and extended by popular demand through March 23rd. But don't wait. Get tickets now at steppenwolf.org. So we've already said Sean Harden is the appointed board president. Appointed member Olga Batista is now the vice president, also representing District 10 on the Southeast side. Who else is emerging as a leader on the board?
Che Reinfest Smith has been a pretty vocal person. He was a vocal candidate also.
Grammy award-winning performer, writer, funded
his own campaign, really independent in that sense as well. He's come out, and our colleagues at WBEZ did a story about him calling for the next superintendent to have an education background, not just a business or financial background. And so he's been vocal in that sense. I think you do see, like I said, there's the Jennifer Custer, who's kind of, I think, forged a more independent voice and certainly represents a district that I think that election was maybe the narrowest in terms of winning with 50% point something. You also see folks like Carlos Rivas. He's my representative on District 3 on the west side. He already held an open house sort of meeting with anybody in the community or parents who wanted to come, has really tried to be out front saying, our job here is really also now to represent the people in our communities. So you have different
carrying
members.
Over that campaigning spirit, just because elections are over doesn't mean I'm not still in the community.
Right. And then I mentioned Jessica Biggs, who was the person that this independent bloc sort of put forward as the vice presidential pick. She's a former principal. She has worked in community organizing since. So I think there's some sort of watching of what role she would take on in terms of leadership or voice. And then, again, they've only met a few times, but we will probably see as they continue to meet, where these board members chime in, where they want to talk a lot, where they ask questions. We'll start to see their emerging priorities, I think, based on how they conduct themselves at meetings, the questions that they ask, if they challenge any votes and that sort of thing.
Last month, the board spent a lot of its meeting focusing on protecting CPS students from immigration and customs enforcement. We also know there are a lot of other big issues facing the district. You mentioned earlier the CTU contract. We've been following very closely the acrimony with CPS CEO Pedro Martinez, who feels 9 toes out of the door, and then the future of certain charter schools in the city we've alluded to earlier. Have we heard anything from the board on any of these issues? We can maybe take it one by one, starting sort of their most recent positions on the role of Chicago Public Schools and the board in protecting young people from ICE.
Sure. So the board, the district really has put out a number of emails and statements about how school communities should respond if ICE agents arrive at a school. We saw this tested a couple of Fridays ago when actually Secret Service agents showed up at a school to investigate something related to someone in their protection. And the principal and the officials at the school mistook them for ICE agents. Either way, they followed all of these protocols. The district came out and said, they did everything correct to protect our students and our communities. The district has been a sanctuary district for a number of years. And last winter, before this new board was sworn in, they did pass a resolution to sort of double down on that commitment to being a sanctuary district, not coordinating with ICE and that sort of thing.
Obviously, CPS CEO Pedro Martinez has been officially fired. This new hybrid board didn't undertake that. It was the board right before they all came into position. How has that been processed under this new 20-person board?
Well, it's really interesting because the selection of a new CEO will fall to this new board. They will have to undergo some kind of a search process and figure out who the next leader of CPS will be. It's possible that the mayor, still plays a pretty heavy role in that. But when the board became an elected board, the idea was for it to operate and act in the same way that boards across Illinois and school boards across the country act. And, picking a superintendent, or in our case, a CEO, approving a budget and, guiding the broader strategic plan of a district. And so if those are their 3 sort of edicts, number one, they're going to test right away. And it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. Now, as it relates to Pedro Martinez still being the CEO for another 6 months, which is part of his contract. And what's really been interesting, I think where it's played out the most significantly, is school board members, even before they voted to fire him that same week, they were trying to get involved more at the table of the bargaining with the Chicago Teachers Union. They wanted to have a seat at the bargaining table, and essentially Pedro filed a lawsuit asking for a temporary injunction, saying that they couldn't do that he, as the CEO, is in charge of those negotiations. And the judge sided with him, Pedro Martinez. And so the board members weren't allowed to go to negotiations. They are not allowed to right now. But there's pushback, I guess, from the board, too, saying, they'd like to get more involved. And even the teachers union has said in some of its recent rhetoric that it's going to start going directly to board members to advocate for an agreement. That's set up a very interesting dynamic as well, because yes, historically, the CPS CEO and the administration is who the union bargains with, but the Board of Education is also like the legal entity written on the contract with whom the agreement is made. And the Board of Ed is who writes your checks out. And the teachers, checks say that, the employer is the Board of Education. And so I think there's been an interesting tension there as well. We did see board president Sean Hardin. The Tribune reported earlier this month that he's using some board funds to hire an outside firm and consultant to essentially help the board identify its budgetary constraints and what would be possible in terms of settling an agreement and paying for a new agreement, as well as balancing the budget as it relates to, if you recall, the dispute over whether the school board and the school system should pay for part of the pension payment for
teaching staff that has been historically covered by the city.
And we were led to believe that that's partly why CPS CEO Pedro Martinez is in his 6-month countdown as we speak.
Because he wasn't going to pay it. He was saying, we don't think that's a budget. Well, it wasn't even that he didn't want to pay it. It was more like, this
isn't financially responsible for the Chicago public schools.
Exactly. And we, in order to do so, would have to take out this high interest loan. Or I should say the mayor's office had proposed, well, in order to cover it, why don't you borrow? And he was like, we're not going to do that because that would be financially detrimental to us.
Not to go in the weeds here, but you mentioned earlier board member Che Reinfest Smith wanting this, in some ways, reimagining of the role of CPS CEO to move away from this idea of leading a business. Public schools are not a business, right? Does it sound like other board members have that same appetite to, beyond the name of the leader of Chicago Public Schools, how they view the role and the responsibilities and, in some ways, the pedagogy of the person in charge?
I think it varies across the board. You mentioned earlier Angel Gutierrez being a bit more of like a budget hawk kind of a school board rep. I know financially, he also has a background in sort of schools and business development. I think he worked for the Archdiocese for a little while as a chief development officer. And so I think there are some board members like him who see no problem with it being called a CEO and having it be somebody who knows how to manage a almost $10 billion budget, that whether you call it a CEO or a superintendent, having somebody with a background in business isn't a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. There's also definitely a camp, and I would say actually, the majority of the board, and potentially some of these independents would say, yes, we agree. Che is also an independent. He wants an educator. I think there are people who think it's time for CPS to ensure or demand that person be an educator in their roots. I mean, Janice Jackson was an educator. She was a teacher, a principal, a network chief. She rose through the ranks at CPS, and I think had the respect of a lot of people in the district. I'm not exactly sure too, like these are hard jobs. And I have to say, like,
Jackson was also, by the end of it, sort of like so many of these leaders, right?
Yeah.
You're going to be put up on the stake to take responsibility for wherever your agency or department is at the time. And for all of the respect that she had, it feels like she was also criticized towards the end in very similar ways.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's very true. And I think we've kind of bounced back and forth. Prior to her, Forrest Claypool, who was not an educator, he was a business guy, also had his critics and concerns and left in a cloud of kind of corrupt concern. And, he was ousted for making some not above board choices ethically. And before him, we had Barbara Bird Bennett, who went to federal prison. She was an educator, though. She came up as a principal and a teacher and a leader.
It sounds like I'm talking to Heather about the police department, which also bounces between like someone who rose through the rank in CPD and some outsider from Texas or some other place. And before him, it was a CPD officer. And before them, it was some outsider. We have this history of doing this.
And sometimes the outsider is a business guy, and sometimes the outsider is an educator. And like, you can't really, these are sort of things where you just, I think, and this is what the board will have to try to govern through and come to compromise with each other on is whatever your filters you want to create are, like, you got to create them and then you run your search and you find the best candidate. Now, again, there's to what weight will the mayor himself tip the scales this time around? This will probably be his last chance to tip the scales, because these 11 appointees will become elected seats in a year and a half. We're going to do this all again, and we're going to have 21 people fully elected. And then it really will fall in the hands of people on this board to select, if not this next CEO, the next one.
With a meeting coming up this week, I know it is too early to say, how is the board doing overall, but what are you most watching in the coming weeks and months?
So obviously, we've talked about the Chicago Teachers Union negotiations. We're watching that, as well as the budget amendment that would have to come out of it. The financial picture. Believe it or not, principals typically get their school budgets for the next school year sometime in April. So while we're only in February, we're not too far away from school budgets for next year. So we're kind of keeping an eye on that. Also, I would say this month we're anticipating the board will get to decide about renewing charter school contracts, which usually happen annually. But the last year and this year, there was pretty much a sort of almost half the charter sector is up for renewal. They were up for renewal last year, and then a whole bunch of them are up again this year. And how the board votes on those renewals will be interesting, because we do have a board that, again, the majority is aligned with the mayor and a little less charter friendly. So will they put them on, whether it's shorter term contracts or more strict contracts? We'll see. But we're watching what happens with those decisions this month and see how these different blocks and new board members vote on the charter renewals.
I want to give a huge thank you to our guest today from Chalkbeat Chicago, Bureau Chief Becky Vevea. Becky, always a good time, my friend.
Thanks so much. It's always a great time to come and talk with you guys. Thanks for having us.
Before we get out of here, please bookmark our website, chicago.citycast.fm. There you can catch up on old podcast episodes, subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago, check out our neighborhood and walking guides, read our articles, which we're updating almost every single day. Just go to the link. There's plenty more to do while you're there. One more thing, some good news. Check out IO Theater's The Armando Experience tonight and every other Monday night. The show concept has been around since 1995, so shout out to 30 years. It features a storyteller or performer and an improv troupe building sketches around the teller's performance or monologue. I've done it, Simone has done it. It's really a good time. I'll drop a link in the show notes for you. As always, we appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.
I mean, it's get the popcorn out. I feel like it's I think the education beat is kind of the best game in town to watch. Mm-hmm. It's interesting and it's really important too. I think it's just, I don't know, maybe that's the mom in me speaking, but
it's the most one that feels like Price is Right has just gone off and the Jeopardy hasn't come on yet. So we like right in the middle of General Hospital. So yeah, it's definitely that one. It's definitely the morning soaps.
For sure. Yeah.